Um, so I know I haven't made any videos recently aside from the one that I just recorded a minute ago, but I would like to try to start doing that somewhat again. It turns out I have not really just like been reading a lot recently, and my desire to like talk about books on the internet is correlated with whether or not I read. However, I would like to talk today about something that I have been planning on making a video about for a long time, because I in fact have a very large number of ideas for videos. I just don't do them. So I think this is going to somewhat echo things that have been said by like various other fantasy booktubers. I would refer you to Jake Bishop or to Bookborn, who have made points that are somewhat similar to, I think, some of the points that I'm going to be making in this video. For example, both of them have talked about this idea of like a Cosmere reading order, or like a Sanderson reading order, which is fine. Like, I don't have any problem with that. Neither of them have any problem with that. However, I think it's important to note that you do not need to follow any order. Obviously, you should probably like read Mistborn Era 2 after Mistborn Era 1, etc. However, aside from obvious things like that and progressing through series chronologically, you do not need to follow a specific order. And I think that is important because although I think many people realize that various people have various different tastes in books, on the internet, in these sorts of communities, there's still this overwhelming idea that is pushed about certain authors where like Mistborn is universally recommended as the best place to start Brandon Sanderson. And Mistborn is a good place to start Brandon Sanderson. I absolutely acknowledge that. However, I think people need to broaden their horizons a little bit. And with various authors, they need to consider starting those authors' works in places other than the default starting point that gets automatically um, recommended by fans. Why do I say this? I say this because although the default starting points are probably the best starting point for a plurality of people, um, for many people, probably even the majority, they are actually not. And of course, if you are just generally recommending some author and you're saying like, as a general rule, if you want to start reading George R. R. Martin, then you should start with Game of Thrones. That is probably a reasonably like decent thing to say. However, I think I would like to put more stress on the fact that for many people that's not true. For example, I was talking to my grandma a long time ago. I like to talk to her about books. I recommended a story called The Lonely Songs of Larendor, which is uh, my favorite short story that I have read by George R. R. Martin. I recommended it to her. She read it. She liked it. I do not know that she will ever read any other George R. R. Martin stories. I would not have recommended Game of Thrones to her, like, uh, just right off the bat. It just doesn't necessarily seem like the sort of thing that she would really like. Maybe she would, but there are many people um, for whom Game of Thrones is probably not a great starting place for George R. R. Martin, who could instead read and probably very much enjoy something like Lauren Dore or the like Sand Kings, maybe, or like A Song for Laya or The Armageddon Rag or both those stories are in Dream Songs. Armageddon Rag or Dying of the Light or like various other things that George has written that I have not read, so I can't really talk about them. Uh, the people who would enjoy those sorts of stories do like that doesn't completely overlap with the people who enjoy A Song of Ice and Fire, and there are a lot of people for whom Song of Ice and Fire is probably not a great starting point who could start with some earlier things by George Martin that are in some ways very different and that a lot of people would probably like more. The same thing's true of Sanderson. Like, there are many people in my real life, I feel like, to whom I would recommend Yumi or Tress as starting points, and I would not recommend Mistborn as a starting point. There are also very many people to whom I would recommend Stormlight as a starting point. I started with Stormlight. Uh, it was absolutely the best place for me to start Sanderson. It is his best work, and there are many people you get on these sorts of online fantasy communities who start with like Mistborn or uh, with Elantris. That happens a lot, and then they're like, "Oh wow, Elantris sucked. I guess I hate Sanderson." And I don't think Elantris sucks, but for some of those people, it's pretty clear to me that if they had read Stormlight, as in they had started with Stormlight, or if they had even like continued with Sanderson and read Stormlight, they would have a much larger chance of getting a fulfilling experience out of that. And you can observe that there are a lot of people who like Stormlight but do not like anything else that Sanderson has written, right? There's a certain type of people, there's a certain type of person, um, and there are a lot of these people in certain like places online who just don't like a lot of the sort of stuff that Sanderson does, and they don't like any of his work other than Stormlight. And those sorts of people should start with Stormlight. And if you're somebody who's watching this who is already a fan of epic fantasy or like certain types of literary fiction, you should consider that the best place to start is not necessarily like Final Empire or Tress, something like that. The best place to start for many people is Stormlight. Um, and let's like this is sort of idealized example, but let's say you're like some guy and you grew up and you read like Rick Riordan and like other like stuff like that, and then you got older and you started reading like more like uh like adult fantasy, and maybe like your favorite author is like Adrian Tchaikovsky or something like that. If you're this hypothetical person, like just read Stormlight. Don't be like, oh, Stormlight's too complicated. Everybody's telling me I need to start with Mistborn, blah, blah, blah. Mistborn is a great starting place for many people, but it's also not a great starting place for many people.